Hello and welcome to the fourth and final session of today, where we focus on Indonesia and Malaysia. I'd like to just take a minute or two to introduce our two speakers. Our speaker on Indonesia is Professor Edward Aspinall of the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. His research focuses on democratization, ethnic politics, and civil society in Indonesia, as well as the separatist conflict and peace process in Aceh. His recent work focuses on the role of ethnicity in everyday politics in Indonesia, as well as money politics more generally. He has authored and edited a number of books on Indonesia, including a much-awaited critical assessment of the SBY administration, which will be published by, of course, ISIS this year. Our second speaker for Malaysia, Mr. Ibrahim Sufyan, is co-founder and program director of the Merdeka Center of Opinion Research. Mr. Ibrahim has a background in business administration and has worked in banking and international development. Since its founding by Mr. Ibrahim, the center has become one of the leading public opinion polling and political survey firms in Malaysia and is now the mandatory place to go to get up-to-date information on prevailing attitudes on key issues, including how popular the Prime Minister is. The Merdeka Center is also a poster child for ASEAN economic integration, as it has provided its opinion polling services in 7 other countries in the region. We'll hear first from Professor Aspinall, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to ISIS for the opportunity to speak here today. It's a great honor for me. And I must say it's great also to speak in the session after Thailand, because I remember a time when the sessions on Indonesia were always the ones filled with doom and gloom. So it's nice to be able to take this opportunity to talk about a much more optimistic outlook for Indonesia at this present time. And of course, that optimism we see concerning Indonesia is very much to do with Indonesia's new president, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as he's popularly known. A president who's very different from all of his predecessors, someone who came to public prominence through a pathway that was intimately associated with Indonesian democratization, not a member of Indonesia's conventional elite, and very much a committed reformer. Now, in this talk, I'm very briefly going to do 3 things. I'm going to talk about a political challenge he faces, his major political challenge, arguably, that is dealing with Parliament. Secondly, I'll talk about a second political challenge, managing his own coalition. And thirdly, I'll finish with some observations on his policy agenda and what we've seen so far. But first, before I do those things, I just want to remind us of the context. And although some of the things I'm going to be saying about President Jokowi might be critical in some respects, they very much have to be contextualized in terms of the political situation we've seen in Indonesia for the last 10 years, and also what might have been. SBY, of course, has now concluded his 10 years as president. And he was a president who gives rise to very divided opinion, in fact. In many ways, his presidency can be seen both as a period of consolidation, but also as a period of stagnation, or at least of missed opportunities for reform. A period of stability, perhaps, but also arguably of stasis. The other kind of alternative universe we need to keep in mind, of course, is what Indonesia would be like had his challenger, Prabowo Subianto, actually won the presidency. And I'm one of those who think that a Prabowo presidency would have been a very bad thing indeed for Indonesia. I've argued that publicly and in print before. Don't have time to go into that now, but very happy to field questions on it. So the political challenges. The first political challenge, of course, is that Jokowi does not have the formal backing of parties that represent a majority of seats in Indonesia's parliament. The parliament, or the DPR, consists of 560 members. Back in March and April, when he was putting together the coalition that would nominate him for the presidency. He refused to do deals or engage in what's known as transactional politics in Indonesia, offer ministries and so on. He took this stance because he'd learned from the SBY presidency. SBY had run the government through oversized so-called rainbow coalitions, which he and many others viewed as a source of corruption in government as ministries became turned into milch cows for the various parties. But also because often those parties that were part of SBY's coalition then in fact didn't support the president on many crucial policy issues within parliament anyway. So the result is that parties that backed Jokowi during the presidential campaign make up 207 of the 560 seats in Parliament. So that's from PDIP up on the top right down to Hanura there. Still quite some distance from a majority. Even if you add PPP or P3, which is represented by one cabinet minister now, we're still short of a majority. Now, early on, after the presidential election, especially after Prabowo's so-called red and white coalition united to pass a law that got rid of direct local government head elections, there was sort of a nightmare scenario painted in a lot of the press about the possibility for deadlock between the presidency and the parliament, a kind of scenario of perpetual confrontation between the two institutions, even talk of impeachment proceedings within the first few years of a Jokowi presidency. The alternative view was that this confrontation we saw between Parliament and President early on was simply a temporary phenomenon. It was really a coalition of convenience amongst the opposition parties that would only hang together so long as the spoils of parliamentary office were to be divided up. Now, I think it's in fact still too soon to be definitive, but I think the currents now are running very swiftly in favour of the second of those interpretations, and that the relations with Parliament will not be as problematic as were often predicted in the early days. I think we're going to see 4 keys to Jokowi's approach to dealing with Parliament. Firstly, it's going to be piecemeal, so different sorts of coalitions being built around different pieces of legislation. A lot of the approaches being made even to individual parliamentarians or parliamentaries within the parliamentary commission structure rather than parties or blocs. It'll combine carrots as well as sticks. The carrots of the economic resources, the government resources that members of parliament need to get re-elected. The stick in terms of the threat of prosecution. Luhut Panjaitan, a man who's very close to President Jokowi, has repeatedly, when asked about this, said that, used a sort of euphemistic language, saying that many DPR members have baggage. And a prime example is this gentleman here, Setio Novanto, the new speaker of the DPR, who has been associated with a very large number of very significant corruption cases in Indonesia. So already we see not too subtle threats emanating from the presidential camp that too much obstruction with the from the parliament could lead to corruption prosecutions. And fourthly, a fourth leg of his approach, I think, is we could be about to see a president who's much more reliant on executive action as a style of government. SBY was really the ultimate consensus politician, very reluctant to take action unless he had as broad support as possible. We've seen a very different approach so far from President Jokowi. For example, when he reduced fuel subsidies last November, many members of parliament said that he needed parliamentary approval for that. He went ahead and did it anyway. Similarly, when he launched new healthcare and education schemes, he did it without parliamentary approval. So that's one side. So in sum, I think the parliament is probably not going to be as big a problem as was initially anticipated, though we really do need to keep a careful watching brief on it. Secondly, working with cabinet or managing the coalition on his own side. I think the lesson so far here shows that although Jokowi promised to do away with transactional politics, to do away with deal-making, he's found this not as easy as some of his early rhetoric suggested. Though it's true that some of the cabinet ministers he were appointed were certainly from the Jokowi sort of mold, so you have very well-known reformers in some posts, such as the Education Ministry. But what was really striking, for me at least as an observer, was in many ways how conventional this cabinet was. That it wasn't so much the new broom that we would sometimes be led to expect from Jokowi's rhetoric. SBY had 6 parties represented in his final cabinet, SBY has 5. And the influence of major power brokers, especially these 3 people, Megawati Sukarno Putri, of course the head of Jokowi's own PDIP party, Surya Paloh, the gentleman with the beard, the head of the Nasdem party and a really major player, it would seem, behind the scenes in the new government and a major businessman in his own right. And then, of course, Yusuf Kala, former vice president, now vice president again, and very much a hands-on vice president, all of these 3 had major influence over the cabinet formation. And presumably they're also going to be playing a big role when it comes to policy. And critically, I think one of the important points to make here is that some of the concessions that Jokowi was forced to make when it came to appointing members of cabinet showed that ended up with him choosing decidedly conventional or non-reformist figures for many, many posts. I don't have a lot of time to go into this. We're happy to do so in discussion time. But perhaps the most striking example is in the defence portfolio, where a former general, Riyamizard Riyakudu, who can only really be described as a very old school Indonesian military general, was appointed, and since being appointed has made all sorts of public comments about reviving various very old school military practices, such as the program Abri Masuk Desa, or the military goes into the village to engage in development programs of various sorts. So some of these appointments, I think, show what are and what are not reform priorities for Jokowi. And one of the clear lessons, I think, from the cabinet is that he's not really that interested in security sector reform, human rights, those sorts of issues. But also, it was also striking, actually, that there were pretty disappointing appointments in some areas that we would think would be very important for his approach to government, the Attorney General, the Ministry of Bureaucratic Reform, and so on. But it's an interesting point here as well that we see something similar as we see in his approach to policy development, that is a more executive-focused, a more presidential-heavy approach to appointments as well. So he's getting around these roadblocks by, for example, appointing real loyalists or reformers to key non-cabinet positions. The most important of these is Luhut Panjaitan as the President's Chief of Staff, and we can expect a lot more of the action now to be taking place in the presidential office itself than we've been used to, I think. Faisal Basri, this respected economist, is the head of a task force on corruption in the oil and gas industry is another. So we see signs, again, very early signs of a much more decisive and much more presidentialist style of government than we're used to in Indonesia, the much more consensus-oriented period of SBY. Moving right along here, let's look at some of the policy priorities and early actions. What are they? What do they tell us? Again, I'm going to just have to really truncate this, and I'll just focus on 3 areas, I think, that have already been revealing. And the first is this already incredibly significant action that the government has taken to reduce, in fact, almost to eliminate fuel subsidies, something that the SBY government struggled with for a decade. These were really crippling subsidies at various points, taking up 20% of the budget. First reduced in November and then just a few days ago removed altogether for premium, diesel switching from a set price to a set subsidy of 1,000 rupiah a litre, producing huge savings, estimated 200 trillion rupiah for 2015, or about almost $16 billion. And this is, of course, going to create huge fiscal space for other policy priorities of the government in infrastructure, military hardware, health and education. One thing to point out, of course, here is that in many ways the government has been extremely lucky in its timing, with oil prices being so low, that this has allowed Jokowi to move much more quickly than had been predicted on this area. And in fact, a few days ago when the subsidy was cut for premium fuel, the price at the Bowser actually dropped. So it could be sold to the population as in fact handing on the benefits of the low world price for oil. A second policy area is this priority he has of cutting red tape. He's the first president with a business background rather than coming from the bureaucracy or the world of politics, and he really believes in this. People who know him say that this is one of the issues on which he gets very enthusiastic, even in person. People say that if you talk to him on certain issues, foreign policy, for example, his eyes tend to glaze over. But on this issue, on streamlining the bureaucracy, making government service more accessible, he really is a true believer. And we see some early action in that area. But the thing I just want to finish on, and I'm afraid I might go 1 or 2 minutes over time, is this, what I think could end up being really the signature policy area for a Jokowi presidency. That is improved welfare services for the population. This, in fact, is a basic goal of his government. I could also talk about education here, but because of limited time, I'll just talk about healthcare. As governor of Jakarta and mayor of Solo, he'd made these health insurance schemes a really important part of his policy agenda, and they were an important part of his popularity as well. And as you can see here, it was also an important part of his campaign, basic stump speeches, holding up these universal health insurance cards that he said would be introduced if he came to office. It's interesting, in fact, that he's launching this policy on the basis of a program that's sort of been rolling out over the last few years, with a move to introduce, under the SBY administration actually, to introduce a universal healthcare insurance scheme by 2019. Launched to much fanfare, almost as soon as he came to office, this Healthy Indonesia card, it's called. It wasn't really clear when it was launched precisely what the difference was between this new scheme and the existing scheme under SBY. Different ministers gave totally different explanations about it, and there was a lot of chaos, it would seem, in the administration behind the scenes. But perhaps this all doesn't matter. If the program gets up and running and is identified in the public mind with Jokowi over the next few years, and it might well be just through this simple mechanism of a new card system, then it is possible that Jokowi will be able to really reap long-term benefits here. Because it's really got to be stressed that the time is ripe for a welfare-oriented president in Indonesia. And we can think of Jokowi as a sort of a potential Thaksin Shinawatra in the making, someone who could really brand himself as a politician who delivered better welfare services to the rest of the population. Because as you can see, Indonesia's spending on healthcare is really very low by regional standards. So I think we do have the possibility here and the beginnings of a new form of welfare-oriented populism in Indonesia, and we need to start looking at countries like Thailand as possible comparisons, but hopefully, of course, not with the sort of aftermath that we've been learning about in Thailand today. So thank you.
If I could now invite Mr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you to the directors of ISEAS for having me here. It is indeed an honor to be able to share some of the views and opinions that I have collected about Malaysia to share with you this afternoon, and hopefully have a fruitful discussion following this. Malaysia is just a short hop away from here. And I think many of the keen observers of Malaysia note that how things are progressing, but albeit in 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think for me, looking into the lens and looking at Malaysia for the coming year, it is probably going to be another transitional year. But transition, I mean transition from a dominant single-party rule towards a potentially comparative two-coalition politics. Transitioning partly because there are forces that want to retain the status quo, and the forces of the future are not quite ready to take the lead and showcase leadership. What we will probably see in 2015 in Malaysia will probably reflect a continuation of events and facts that have already been established on the ground since the country's 2008 election and formalized or concretized in the 2013 elections. Essentially, what we see is that although the ruling coalition Barisan Nasional, or the BN, will continue to remain in power right up to the next election and potentially even into the future, due to various abilities that it has, the powers of incumbency, its position is increasingly eroded by a number of different factors, by political forces within the coalition and outside the coalition. Within Malaysian society itself, a society that I will discuss further, within the rising Islamization and push for more Islam in public life. Second point, demographics. A country that has a very large youthful population that is going to assert itself on even more greater pressure on the ruling government and in the country's politics in the coming elections expected at the end of 2017-2016. And then we also have, I think, the economic condition where Malaysia, as the sole net oil exporter in the region, is already suffering from the effects of the decline in the prices of oil and other commodities. So, in a nutshell, that essentially encompasses the gist of my presentation this afternoon. And I think we'll also spend a bit of time looking at Malaysia's international commitments, as Malaysia takes on the chair of ASEAN this year, as well as takes on a position in the UN Security Council. So, if we look into Malaysian politics, I think there are 3 principal areas where I think we will have continued discourse. The ongoing, long-standing discourse over ethnic politics in the country, where the contestation of communal interests will remain, where people, certain segments of society, particularly those aligned with the senior party in UMNO and their allies, will continue to exploit Malay or ethnic Malay resentment against non-Malay economic successes in order to continue to protect their base, which is fraying, I mean, describe fraying at the edges as younger people come into the political or electorate market and are becoming more increasingly disappointed on account of the economy. You have a situation of inter-coalition dynamics that are asserting itself, and I think in much greater fashion now as compared to the past, as well as intra-coalition dynamics within both the opposition, Pakatan Rakyat, and the ruling Barisan Nasional. And finally, I think with respect to politics is the question of leadership. The leadership of current Prime Minister Najib Tun Razak, the possibility of future leaders that may continue the stranglehold of Barisan Nasional over the country's politics, and the potential of the opposition to supply leaders that can lead the country into the future, potentially in the next general election. So when we look at these types of issues, in terms of intra-coalition dynamics, the results of the election has established the ruling party UMNO, the senior party UMNO, as the most dominant party in the government, and ostensibly a lot of cabinet appointments, government-linked corporation appointments, and other appointments to statutory bodies that command access over economic resources and decision-making has fallen to members of the senior party. And this, I think, has generated some level of dissatisfaction within other political parties in the governing coalition that represent the interests of minorities and the other regions, especially in Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak. So along with this, the pursuit of the Malay agenda geared towards generating Malay support towards the ruling coalition is alienating support from other ethnic groups, particularly non-Muslim ethnic groups. And we find that increasingly over the last decade, this is not a recent phenomenon, this is a phenomenon that we've seen developing since 1999 and has continued on this trajectory, moving further and further to the right of the political spectrum, is increasingly alienating not just minorities on the mainland, but also minorities in Borneo, which I think is going to play into the next election as the ruling party increasingly is dependent on support from Sabah and Sarawak to remain in power. Moving on to the opposition, you have an opposition that's made up of 3 disparate parties. In many sense, reflecting a marriage of convenience united by the desire to take federal power, but the differences cannot be more acute as we are seeing right now. So what is happening in the opposition is also a reflection, a mirror reflection of what's happening inside the ruling coalition. As UMNO clause tries to retain Malay support, so does the Islamic Party, and doing what they are most familiar by trying to introduce Sharia into the states that they control and introducing more Islamic elements in the public life of the country. And this element threatens not just the integrity of the opposition coalition, but also the social fabric of the nation, as Malaysia is only about 60% Muslim. A significant proportion of the population are non-Muslim, and along which vast numbers of people are not fully confident or comfortable with the way things have been done, because the country has had a long tradition of secular democratic leadership. And I think all of this points down to leadership, in the sense Malaysia being a country that continues to be held by a dominant party, and it's the president of the party is supposed to be dominant. So questions are arising as to the leadership of the current prime minister. He has a lot of things on his plate. He has pursued, I would say, a fairly robust economic agenda to reform, and he has put in place the subsidy reductions that he's promised to do. So, like the president of Indonesia, he has also cut fuel subsidies completely, and he's supported by the fall in oil prices. And he has also tried to reform the civil service by making them more responsive. But he has problems in managing the internal critics that he has within his own party, the people who are used to the established order of doing things and the lack of transparency that comes along with it. And these are the problems that he has to contend. As of now, the Prime Minister continues to have, I would say, a strong hand over the party. But 3 years in Malaysian politics is an eternity between now and the next general election. The forces that are there, who are in disagreement with his policies, are not insubstantial. And so we expect to see 2015 to be a very dynamic year within the senior party UMNO and BN, likewise in the opposition. So for the opposition, we are likely going to see a leadership transition. I think some elements of the press and the people in the region are aware about the trial surrounding opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. So we are not certain when the trial results are going to come out. It reflects some level of intransigence or uncertainty as to what the impact of the decision will be. Because I think from an analytical standpoint, an acquittal for Anwar strengthens him, but brings attacks on the established leadership, on the leadership of the BN from their internal critics. But jailing him, putting him in jail also will strengthen the opposition by creating a martyr. So there is a win-win situation for Anwar in this case. But we also expect transitions to happen in the other opposition parties as the senior leadership, begin to hand over power to younger leaders. And I think the party to watch in Malaysia right now, at least for 2015, is the Islamic Party, because in June they will have party elections, and you will see, I think, a very substantial contest between progressive elements of the party that want to remain in a coalition with the other opposition parties that supports a more moderate brand of Islam and in favor of postponing, quote-unquote, postponing their Islamist agenda in order to provide a viable two-party system as opposed to a more conservative cleric-centered faction that's also trying to take back the party. So that's going to happen in June. And the outcome of that party election is going to determine on whether or not the opposition in Malaysia survives as a coalition, and thus, enable us to expect that a two-party or two-coalition system will become a long-term feature of the country's politics. Because of the flux and the fluctuations that we are seeing in Malaysian politics, given that the ruling party only commands about 1/2 of the popular support, and increasingly a challenge in order to command support from among the youth, we see other forces asserting itself in Malaysian society. The palace, the 9 traditional royal institutions in Malaysia, made up of the sultans of the different states, including neighboring Johor, have increasingly played an important role in shaping policies on the ground, not just in business, but also political appointments, development policies, as well as projects. So the palace is increasingly asserting itself. Likewise, pressure groups, particularly in the form of organized Muslim mass organizations, are increasingly making some impact on the political arena in Kuala Lumpur. So if you look at the public mood in Malaysia, the mood is increasingly negative. Majority of the people feel the country is in the wrong direction. And in part, this is driven by concerns over rising cost of living. Majority of Malaysians enjoy high levels of subsidies over things like fuel, healthcare, public transport, food, and other items, and these subsidies are gradually being withdrawn or cut. And along with it, you have a substantial number, perhaps 2/3 of the population that lives under low-income levels, and the increase in cost of living is causing some disquiet amongst the sector. And likewise, the popularity of the Prime Minister is slowly ebbing away. I think the latest number is about 45%. As well as the popularity of the government is slowly also decreasing to about 38%. So you have a situation where the government is increasingly, people are increasingly becoming dissatisfied from the government. That is not to say that things cannot change, because the next election is only going to be in 3 years' time. So these are some of the important things as I try to wrap up. Islam in public life, I think, is going to loom very large in 2015 and 2016 onwards as we move towards national elections at the end of 2017, 2018, largely because Islam has become increasingly used as the single most important identifier in politics, either you are with us or against us. And the rising confluence of politics and religion is giving off other spin-off effects, in the sense of the rise of other pressure groups that are promoting a more conservative brand of Islam, whether in social life. So we have a lot of groups that are going around in the pubs and the movie theaters, handing out leaflets, asking people to behave in more conservative fashion. But on a more dangerous note, we also notice that due to the expansion of the internet, more, I would say, fundamentalists, even closely related to IS type of propaganda, are making its way into Malaysian social media and influencing large numbers of young people. So there is a bit of a tinge of danger in this area. And the next election will likely be decided by the youth. In the last election that took place in 2013, young people aged below 30 years old made up about 54% of the electorate. By the next election, due to the bulge in the youth population of the country, you're going to have upwards of 60%, and the vast majority of them, about 2/3, are going to be Malay Muslims. So Islam, youthfulness, will definitely going to play an important role in the country's political life in the coming years to come, and increasingly also how the government performs in its economic agenda. And one, I think, important event that's going to happen this year that's likely going to have significant impact besides the political events is the introduction of the goods and services tax. And it has to be seen in this context that although it is just 6%, has numerous exemptions over items that are described as basic needs, it is going to be implemented on a population where 80% of the people do not pay any form of tax, and where maybe 2/3 are subsisting on relatively low levels of household income. So we think that the impact on the populace is definitely going to be significant. The challenge is on whether the government's leadership under Najib Tun Razak and his political allies can hold it together for the coming 3 years, turn around the economy, and meet the opposition head-on in 2017, 2018. This is definitely going to be an important issue to watch. I think the other points that I just want to briefly mention is the expansion of the internet. I think it goes without saying that Malaysia has, I think, the second highest level of population wiredness in the region. But amongst young people, the people who are going to make their voices heard and votes count in 2018, internet penetration is nearly 100%, and therefore the government no longer has a monopoly over information as they have had for decades in the past. So this may partly explain, some of the action taken by the Malaysian government right now to change maybe the head of the Multimedia Commission to someone who is more loyal to the political party and so on. So some appointments may be taken, maybe more action under the law against people who are uttering seditious remarks may be taking place. But the second important event is the economy. The decline in oil prices, I think, will severely crimp government spending over the coming year. We are not sure how the government is going to react. No statement has come out from them. We'll be watching for that. But the significant decline in takings from Petronas is definitely going to be a major setback for the Malaysian government for 2015 onwards. So just to quickly wrap up, before that. I did want to make a mention about the role of Malaysia in ASEAN and the Security Council. Given the kind of issues that is definitely going to occupy the Prime Minister, it is certainly a year that's going to be a bit testing for Malaysia. Because although we have a foreign ministry, a lot of the foreign policy is driven by the Prime Minister's office itself. A lot of the visits, a lot of the policies are coming from the PM. And given that he has so many things on his plate in 2015, it is going to be a bit of a challenge to stretch all of that attention to also cover attention on ASEAN and UN Security Council. With respect to ASEAN, I think the issue that's definitely going to be, people are going to look at is how is Malaysia going to balance its positive relationship with China vis-a-vis the other tensions and the other issues that other countries in the region within ASEAN would have towards China. Within the UN Security Council, how does Malaysia balance its own increasing relationship with Iran, which is the third largest importer of palm oil, vis-a-vis issues that can emerge if Iran restarts its nuclear enrichment program and thereby attracts attention from the UN Security Council. So how will Malaysia vote? And that is, for the most part, I think, the external impact. Internally or domestically, the impact is pretty minimal, largely because most of the domestic public does not really understand or follow what is going on in ASEAN, like the previous speaker who talks about how this principle of non-interference in domestic affairs means also blissful ignorance. And with respect to the UN Security Council, there will also be some scrutiny in terms of the human rights and rule of law record in Malaysia as things move forward. So just to quickly wrap up, I think we are going to see continued contestation. Both coalitions will face strong challenges from within and without. Islam will remain important, if not a growing area of competition, allowing for room for unintended consequences, and cost of living increases due to GST and other associated impact will definitely have a negative impact on the electorate and affect the government's popularity going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers for very enlightening presentations. Before opening the floor to discussion, I'd like to get in a couple of questions of my own. So, Ed, could I ask you to expand a little bit more on your concept of executive action? You've mentioned that under Jokowi, we're going to see a much more sort of robust presidential sort of role being carried out. Could you help us understand under what contexts or what institutional circumstances the president can actually push forward policies without the support of Parliament? And perhaps you may like to mention a little bit about how this could be applied in the case of education, which is, I think, a policy area that you mentioned.
Thanks for the question. So one of the key points, just as a sort of preliminary note here, is that the Parliament can't pass any law against the will of the President. The Constitution says that legislative products are products of the agreement between the parliament and the president. So if there's no presidential representation during the process of deliberating on a bill, that bill can't pass. So the maximum that the parliament can do is frustrate the government's legislative agenda. It can't pass legislation that runs against the desires of the president. Now, the more direct answer to your question is really on a lot of these questions, you know, it's partly a watch this space sort of a question, because President SBY never really pushed the envelope on this. So he never really tried to test the limits of presidential power. Having said that, though, one particular feature of Indonesian laws is worth noting here, that almost every single law that's passed by the parliament will have dozens, you know, sometimes 50, sometimes 100 qualifications in key passages. So there'll be an article in a law which says, you know, a national education system will be set up involving A, B, and C, and then there'll be a qualifier saying, as regulated by further governmental regulations. And those governmental regulations can take the form of a presidential decree, a ministerial regulation, and so on. So already, my guess would be, within Indonesia's existing legislative structure, there's actually huge scope there for using the existing laws without even having to pass new laws through the parliament for quite serious reform. I'm sort of saying, kind of thinking about this as I say it, so I can't think in particular about the education system, but my guess would be that the National Education Law has many of those sort of very rubbery clauses that could be used by the Education Minister or by the President.
Thank you very much. A second question. Could you share with us your thoughts on whether Jokowi's policies will have an explicit internal regional component? So we know that, you know, in the western part of the country, it's relatively well connected. We have the whole eastern part that is not very well connected. And we also know that Jokowi did quite well in specific provinces and less well in others. Will we see this as sort of a factor in his policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So he did very well in eastern parts of the country, where a lot of, especially in those areas where non-Muslim minorities live. He had a huge vote in places like Papua, and East Nusa Tenggara province and so on. And it is true that a lot of his emphasis on infrastructure, in particular this program or policy or I don't know what you concept for a so-called sea toll road, which is really a kind of a series of new development of port infrastructure and so on. That a lot of that does seem to be focused on the east. So I guess it's an interesting question how that then sits with the regional distribution of his support, because he had some real problems in the presidential election, in particular provinces, but also in Sumatra as a whole. So I guess it could be seen, looking, prophesizing a few years down the track, that if he's overly favouring Eastern Indonesia, which is the poorest part of Indonesia, we should remember as well, there could be some sort of blowback in Sumatra or further west. Interesting point.
Thank you very much. Ibrahim, if I could get in a couple. At the moment, we have a discussion about the redelineation of electoral boundaries. And in the past, of course, BN has traditionally had more than 2/3 representation in parliament. That is no longer the case. Could you help us see through some of the potential scenarios that could be occurring at this point in time?
Yeah, certainly. Redelineation has been one of the hallmarks of the Malaysian political process, where every 10 years you have the electoral boundaries being redrawn to reflect changes in demographics. But the critics of the process have for the past, seen that a lot of times when new boundaries are drawn, it's also drawn in favor of the ruling coalition. The current redistricting process has been delayed for several years now, and I think it's expected to take place in March. We have a situation where the proponent of the redelineation needs 2/3 parliamentary majority in order to increase the number of parliamentary seats. However, they only need a majority, 50% plus 1, to amend pre-existing boundaries, to change pre-existing boundaries while keeping the numbers of the seats in parliament the same. The current scenario that we see is that I think people aligned with the ruling party is keen to see the seats in parliament increase by a further 20%, and thereby bringing the number of seats in the House by an additional 45 or so from the current 222. And the way that the proposals, the sneak previews that some people have been able to see from the proposals, it appears to have confirmed the practice of the past. So there is a likelihood that while some elements of negotiations take place, this is going to be a very difficult process in favor of the BN. So going to the second part of the questions about scenarios. I mean, scenario one is that the opposition stays together and blocks this proposed new seats. And thereby they will have to contend with the same number of seats. However, the pre-existing seats may be, the boundaries may be amended somewhat. I think it's a bit more difficult to engineer a victory for the ruling coalition, largely because there has to be some semblance of legitimacy with this process. Number two, another scenario would be to entice one party from the opposition coalition to come along and support the redelineation process, and thereby allowing the ruling party to gain the 2/3 majority. I think this is something that's in the works right now, with people inside UMNO talking to people inside the Islamic Party, trying to increase the number of seats, particularly Malay Muslim seats, and in return supporting the proposal from the Islamic Party to introduce Sharia in their state of Kelantan. So we have that scenario. A third scenario would be to go ahead with this proposal, and then it gets, yeah, those are pretty much the two most likely scenarios. The third scenario is just going on with the current seats as they are currently drawn, and at the same number of 222, the outcome of which could be, it's hard to say, but could potentially be bad for the government come the next election.
Thank you very much. Another quick question. You had mentioned a possibility of Anwar Ibrahim going to jail, being a sort of martyr figure. Were that to eventuate, who do you think could emerge as sort of the de facto figurehead leader of the opposition?
Yeah, I think before we get to the Anwar question, I think the developments within the Malaysian opposition has somewhat moved beyond Anwar, largely because I think Anwar has been seen as an instrumental figure because he has been able to glue these three very disparate parties, the Democratic Action Party, the Islamic Party, and his own party together in this coalition. And I think for a while it has worked largely because it was in everybody's interest to try and make an attempt for federal power. But the developments inside the Islamic Party has gone to the point where it's moved beyond the ability of Anwar Ibrahim to assert his influence. So until the Islamic Party resolves itself, the viability of the opposition coalition currently remains uncertain. So if the opposition party, the Islamic Party in June continues to elect progressive leadership, then the coalition remains intact and they move forward, and the role of Anwar could potentially diminish or be enhanced. But if, let's say, he fades into the sunset, then I think the likely successor will be his number two in the party, the current Chief Minister of Selangor. At this current point in time, he is seen as a state leader. He has not developed a national profile, so to speak, but because you have a period of 3 years between now and the next general election, there's potentially time for him to develop this profile, and he's closely modeling himself after the Indonesian President Jokowi, using pretty much the same kind of populist measures and appearance methods.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to some of the questions coming in Pigeonhole, and we have one that's very, very popular with regards to Indonesia, and it's, does the military pose some sort of risk to the Jokowi presidency?
Thanks for the question. The short answer would be no, not at the moment, because the military is getting what it wants out of Jokowi. In particular, We've seen the appointment of a hardliner as a defense minister, Riamiza Riakudu, the man I mentioned earlier. Moreover, it's not just that he's a hardliner, but that he's the first non-civilian defense minister for 15 years. And we see the military, in fact, taking advantage of this situation. So, for example, we've seen the establishment of a new territorial military command in eastern Indonesia. So long as there's no threat posed by the Jokowi government towards the military, I don't expect that we could see the military reciprocating. Just as a kind of a little footnote, I think in the long run, I think the military is still a very problematic institution in Indonesia. It's still not really subject to proper civilian control or authority. But in any sort of reasonable scenarios we can think of, the only moment that they would be able to intervene would be in moments of crisis in the civilian political system. So looking forward, you imagine a rerun of a very close election like this year, perhaps one where the results are even closer, where there's real question about the veracity of the results. That's the sort of situation in which the military could pose a real threat. But at the moment, they're successfully defending their autonomy, so they have no reason to cause problems, direct problems to the government.
Thank you very much. And for Ibrahim, we have an interesting question on Sabah and Sarawak. It's actually two questions, and it is, will the secession issue affect BN's position in Sabah and Sarawak? And perhaps looking a little bit further forward, can Sabah and Sarawak cope with being independent?
Right. Thank you. The secession question is something that's, I think, very sensational, and it's a bit shocking, partly because it was not in the radar for nearly 2 decades, and it's now come back. And it is, I think, in the first place, a reflection of how contested politics have become, how, I would say, somewhat diminished the power of the central ruling party has been over the last 2 election cycles, and now that this has come out. It is, in a sense, a manifestation over the unhappiness of voters in Sabah and Sarawak, particularly indigenous people who are non-Muslim, predominantly Christian and traditional faiths, believe that they have been bypassed in the sense of development and also political representation in the country. So there is some traction, particularly inside Sabah, because Sabah has always had that streak for independence, of independent mindedness amongst its voters. However, things have changed on the ground in the sense that due to immigration, the demographics of the state have substantially changed. That even if a vast majority of the native Christian population were to vote against the federal government in favor of something resembling secession, it wouldn't pass through, largely because the Muslim component of the population has been substantially increased over the last 3 decades. And I think it's only now that people have begun to realize, due to the outcome of a Royal Commission of Inquiry, how substantially different the demographic of the makeup of the state has become. So you have that going on. But on the flip side to that, there is possibility for more autonomy to be granted to the state, particularly in terms of appointment of senior officials in the state government, in terms of development projects that are being implemented in the state. Like in the past, many development projects, infrastructure development particularly, are being passed on to companies that are from West Malaysia. So there's greater likelihood that indigenous or Sabah or Sarawak-based companies will be given this contract, so thereby mollifying the elites and also the business elites in the states. And I think finally, the ruling coalitions in these particular states, they are a franchise of the Federal Barisan Nasional. They too will have a bit more leeway in terms of the policies they institute in these own states, and thereby create a valve to let off some of this pressure over time. And whether or not these 2 states can survive independently, I am a bit skeptical on that particular note, largely because for the longest time, a lot of decision-making has been dictated from Kuala Lumpur, and I think a lot of the planning has been taken out in Kuala Lumpur as well. It will take some time before both of these states develop the kind of capacity to manage things that are beyond the basic development and infrastructure and so on.
Thank you very much. We'll get in two quick questions based on Pigeonhole before we open the floor for questions. A question for Edward. Will the Red and White Coalition play the religious card against Jokowi in the coming years, particularly by forming a conservative front centered around religious and nationalistic values?
Great question again. So let me respond on the religious rather than the nationalist issue, because I think they're a bit different. So on the religious issue, I think the temptation to do something like that will be very strong. One of the really significant lessons of the presidential campaign was that there was this sort of, underground, sort of dirty campaign, rumors and SMS messages and so on, alleging that Jokowi was a Christian, that he was Chinese, that he was from Singapore, in fact, or had Singaporean ancestry. And although at the time many of us sort of laughed about this, in fact it was quite effective. And if you look at the composition of the two coalitions, or at least the kind of the PDIP with its strong support in Christian and other areas, you could see that the temptation to run that sort of a campaign against the president would be very great. But I should say that also the risks would be very great for the coalition as well. It would potentially split. Perhaps split is an overdramatic word, but it will place tensions within the Red and Right coalition. A party like Gerindra, for example, primarily gets its voter base in exactly the same areas that the PDIP does, so usually amongst nominal Muslims in Java and also quite strong in non-Muslim areas. Prabowo himself is very aware that he remains very weak. His support base in the last election was very weak in non-Muslim areas of Indonesia. I forget the exit polls, but he might even have, the results could have been different, or at least Jokowi's margin of victory would have been much, much less had Jokowi's support in non-Muslim areas not been so high. So I think, though, the temptation will be there, and there might be some sort of campaigning in the media, or even more so in a sort of an informal way, but to constitute some sort of informal, open, frontal Islamic campaign against a government involving the major parties would just have too many risks for the major components of the Red and White coalition itself.
Thank you so much. Now we have quite an interesting question for Malaysia. Najib has clearly fallen out of favor with former PM Mahathir. There seems to be a movement afoot to have Muqriz as PM at some point. Is this likely, and when? Could we broaden this question as well to perhaps include other potential successors, not just Muqriz?
Yeah, certainly. I think if a little bit of an introduction into recent Malaysian political history. I mean, if one observes Malaysian politics, Dr. Mahathir has been responsible for the downfall of nearly all prime ministers, with the exception of Razak, the second prime minister, because he passed away. And he was also responsible for his own exit from the prime ministership of Malaysia. So I think the rumors and discussions in the coffee houses of KL has been rife about the unhappiness expressed by former PM Dr. Mahathir towards the prime minister. And so it's this is, I think, the most interesting question in town right now. Looking at, first of all, in terms of how likely is this going to happen, well, 3 years between now and the next general election, and 2 years between now and the next party election is going to be an eternity for Prime Minister Najib in order to maintain his position on power. As things currently stand, Prime Minister Najib has control over the grassroots of the party. He controls perhaps 2/3 of the division heads of the party. These are the people that need to assert themselves to the party Supreme Council if a coup, an internal coup, a vote of no confidence is to be instituted against him. He also controls nearly all of the members of the Supreme Council. However, these are human beings and they are not static, and given that the political climate is so dynamic, things can change. And how can things change? I've mentioned earlier in my presentation about the GST. The GST, the goods and services tax, is something that Dr. Mahathir has opposed. Dr. Mahathir has also opposed giving cash transfers to voters. When this GST is implemented, we expect the Prime Minister's popularity, approval rating, and as well as standing within the party to drop, because the party is acutely aware of, of the weakness of the base. And if it perceives that this Prime Minister is more of a liability than of an asset to them, and it's likely that they will be swayed by the arguments by Dr. Mahathir. In terms of timing, it could potentially happen any time after April this year. It can extend, all the way up to the next party general election. That is in terms of timing. But in terms of likelihood, I think here's where it's uncertain. One thing that's for certain is that I think Prime Minister Najib is, unlike his predecessor Abdullah, is not going to quit and is not going to just resign or take step down. He's possibly going to fight for his post. And he has tremendous resources at his disposal to do so. And he has not actually done that. And so it remains to be seen. But I think the likely outcome is going to be very, I would say, very, disastrous is a very strong word, but going to be very problematic for UMNO, because the time that it takes for them to heal, whether a change occurs or not, will not be enough in order for them to face the next general election. If a transition is successful, then there will be a kind of reset and perhaps they can win back some public support. If it is not successful, then they will go to the election much more weakened and split internally than before. So having said that, who are the likely successors? There's been talk in Kuala Lumpur that there will be an interim, headed by the Deputy Prime Minister and then followed by others. The problem is that beyond the current Deputy Prime Minister, many of the other figures are seen as to be lightweights. The three vice presidents of UMNO are seen to be relatively lightweight and do not really have the kind of charisma to hold the country together. Likewise, if it goes to Mukris, perhaps Mukris would be in line sometime in the future, but not immediate, say, within this current election cycle.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to open the floor for just a round of questions. Beyond your normal stipulations of affiliation and so forth, could I make one request that they be Twitter-style questions, so 140 characters or less? Do I see any hands? You, sir, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Santitan from Credit Suisse. Question on Indonesia. So do you think that the success of President Jokowi in reform so far, the subsidy, scrapping of subsidies, do you think that increased the chance of further reform, success of further reforms, or it actually reduced the probability of further reforms because it caused backlash that make it difficult to push other things through?
It's a great question. I hadn't thought of it quite that way. I would say that it's really increased the possibility of perhaps reform is not the right word, but it's certainly increased the possibility of new spending initiatives in areas that really do need new measures such as education, health, infrastructure in particular. I mean, infrastructure is something we haven't really talked about, but the country had a really very poor record under SBY. I mean, infrastructure spend as a proportion of GDP is something like half of what we see in places like India and China. So my general sense at the moment is that not only providing greater resources, it's also given a sort of a shot in the arm to the government, that they thought this was going to be so difficult, and in fact, partly just because of the fortuitous fall in the world oil prices, that they're really riding high. That's just a sort of a gut feeling response, though.
Okay, if we could have a brief question.
What do you think going to be the Jokowi's policy when it comes to religious tolerance and pluralism, especially with the reappointment of the Lukman Hakim Saifuddin, that's so many observers thought to be a more moderate religious affairs minister compared to his predecessors. Will there be any changes in your view?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so basically I think that logic would suggest that there will be significant change in this area. This is one area where SBY is accused of, I guess you would say, negligence or sometimes even of complicity in a rising tide of religious intolerance in the country in things like, local level attacks against religious minorities and so on. So I think it's certainly the case that the new Religious Affairs Minister, I think, has already demonstrated very clearly that he is far, far more tolerant than his predecessors on religious minorities issues, Shia, Baha'is and so on. He's already made very supportive public statements in that regard. And we've also, the other critical appointment here, I think, is the Internal Affairs Minister, Cahyo Kumolo, who's a PDIP party hack, in some ways not a very exciting figure, but on these sorts of issues, I mean, he is a dyed-in-the-wool secularist. So we can expect, I think, a much more interventionist central government when it comes to those sorts of issues.
Regrettably, we have completely run out of time, so I would ask you to join with me in thanking our two speakers.